I can adjust the title if necessary on YouTube. We get so spoiled with instantaneous response. Oh, there we go. I get nervous when it's not. And that's there. And back to here. And we pop that and hit share, share, share. And then we have slideshow, so it goes full screen. And then control shift H to hide the floating controls. And then I pin myself, use the primary window, and shrink that. Okay, yes. And just trying to get us a little bit in screen, although everybody should be reading that off the main thing. And I just want to make sure that if I wander back and forth, I'm still in. I like to wander. Did someone go by? Someone did walk by. Let me just double check. I don't want to start if there's someone lingering. Okay, maybe they were just maybe it was just security checking something. Yeah. Okay, so here we are for part 2 of Megillat Esther chanting. If you haven't watched part 1, go back. But we will do a quick review for some of those tropes as well. But before we get into that review and the new trope that we're doing, I want to talk about a couple of the considerations when chanting, because it's a little different chanting for Purim than it is for chanting Torah. Like we talked about last week, Torah chanting is very straightforward. It's very frontal, it's very clear. The trope melodies are not as fluid because it's cut, 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 cut to make sure that it's precise. Purim, the melodies by themselves are already a little bit, not fancier, but more lyrical, I guess is probably the right way. But there is also a custom in many, many communities of trying to jazz it up a little bit, to make it a little bit funnier, because Purim is considered to be a fun and funny holiday. And there is a lot of humor within the book of Esther. It's not exactly, Laurel and Hardy humor. It's not exactly slapstick or in your face. It's certainly not even Monty Python. But there is a lot of subtle jabs and hints of inadequacy of different people, terminology that's used that is certainly laden with innuendo. There's a lot going on in the subtext that can give a good chuckle. So there is room for funny. And of course, Purim has in the modern world, for a couple hundred years, been heavily emphasized as the fun holiday. It's one of the holidays where we have this distinct party that is required. Having a seudah, a feast, is one of the mitzvahs of Purim. We do it at the end of the day of Purim, not the night of Purim. A lot of people get that wrong, especially when the drinking is involved. It's not meant to be a 24-hour binge fest. And then with the shouting or stamping at Haman's name, the waving of groggers, and all of the costume, it definitely gets a carnival atmosphere. So the question is, how much do we make the chanting fun to go along with that? Well, we're going to look at some examples of that, but we also have to bear in mind the actual text of the Megillah is really more of a political thriller that has a bit of comedy rather than a comedy that has a bit of political action going on to it. This is much closer to West Wing than Veep as far as its content and its style. And we are meant to be on the edge of our seats watching the politics of behind the curtain in the Persian court when our lives are hanging in the balance. And while we definitely have good reason to chuckle at many places, it's also meant to be tense. One of the things that gets reflected in is there are detours in the book of Esther. Not in the text itself, but in the chanting of the book of Esther. There are about half a dozen or so verses that don't get chanted in the melody of Purim. They get chanted in the melody of Eicha, the book of Lamentations, which is what we read on Tisha B'Av, the day of calamity. So there are these little hints peeking through the text, if you will, in the tradition of chanting to actually make it sadder, to reflect on how we got there and what was at stake. And definitely, if you want a challenge, I'm more than happy to give you a passage where there is a detour in it, where we do both Purim melodies and Eicha melodies. But it is a challenge because you've got to switch back and forth between them. And that isn't always easy. It's not easy for me. Some people I know are more musically talented and they can switch those melodies, no problem. But if you want a challenge, let me know. But we will cover that at another time. We're not doing the melody for Eicha tonight because we're still doing the groundwork for Purim itself, but we will come back to that. If you want to know how funny to be, well, talk to your community. In this case, a TI, me. But if you're not part of TI, talk to your community and find out, are we going for a really raucous? Are we going for a kid-friendly? Are we going for something that is a little more somber, but still has a chuckle to it? Find out what tone the community wants. Because if they really want to start going funny, I have seen all of these done, and it can be quite hilarious. There are certain keywords scattered throughout the story. So mishte, the drinking party, comes up a lot because, well, a lot of Purim is set at drinking parties. That's kind of why we end up with a lot of drinking during the holiday now. And you'll hear many people, every time they say the word mishte, followed up with a little bit of a parody of a drunken hiccup. Likewise, the word sus, meaning horse, shows up in multiple places. And depending upon how well you are at barnyard imitations, throwing a little is perfectly fine to do. Saris means eunuch. People will often do that in a slightly squeakier voice, since eunuchs were physically made eunuchs back in the day. Whenever you're reading a line of Haman, that is to say, one of his quotes, you'll hear people do it in sort of the snively whiplash melodrama, ha 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 ha, plotting voice. Likewise, Ahasuerus, it's usually sort of the bumbling sound. And Zeresh is often done with more of a which is cackling, Wizard of Oz kind of voice. Now, all of this is fun, but some of these voices actually is also helpful because it lets people hear this character was talking, that character was talking, this character was talking, which, as beautiful as the trope is, the trope does not lend itself innately to doing it. It is just the grammar of the sentences, not the flavor of the sentences. And sometimes this really does help break up the trope in a way that makes it more accessible to the average listener. And you'll also hear people do wolf whistles whenever Esther's beauty is being mentioned. And there are many other little tidbits that are picked up in different communities around the world and throughout history. So nothing wrong with having fun as long as that's the Purim that you and your community are going for. So double check with whoever is leading your Megillah reading and find out, can I do the funny sounds? Do you want me to do the funny sounds? Or I can't do the funny sounds, and then find the balance that works. All right, any questions on that? All right. Then let's get to the big question. Come on. Okay, so this is something that I have seen rabbis since I was a kid, all the way through my professional career, and also myself continue to struggle with. So we all know that when you hear Haman's name, you shout, you boo, you raise your groggers. And we're doing this because, well, it's kind of a mitzvah. Deuteronomy 25 says that we are to blot out the name of Amalek. Amalek was a tribe that attacked us when we left Egypt. They were especially bad, targeting the weak and the helpless at the back of the caravan. They are considered to be the worst of the worst. In the ancient world, you would say Amalek, where in the modern world, you might say Nazi. So these are terrible, terrible people and stand for terrible, terrible people. So we block them out. Well, Haman is an Agagite. Haman Ha'agagi is how he is introduced in the text. And Agag was the last king of the Amalekites when they still had a coherent community, who was killed under the reign of King Saul. So Haman is considered to be a descendant of the Amalekites, and therefore we try to blot out his name as well. That's why we blot out his name, but we don't blot out Pharaoh when we're doing the Haggadah, because there's no commandment to blot out the Egyptians. In fact, we're told not to resent the Egyptians despite what they did. The Amalekites, however, are fair game. So how do we do that? Because we still need to read and hear every word of the Megillah. The technical way it is meant to be done, that is to say, if you ask any rabbinic authorities, is When you hear the word Haman, then the congregation is meant to do the boo, the groggers, etc. And when that has stopped, then you continue with the reading. That if you were to continue reading during the booing, people wouldn't hear the other words. Plus, you'd be booing at the wrong point, and you might be booing for the wrong thing. What's the problem with that system? No one ever stays within the lines, right? It's like a coloring book. No one colors in the lines. And that means that you have people booing as Haman's name is being said, which is drowning out his name, which seems like it is in support of the actual mitzvah, but it also means that we're now failing to read the actual Megillah completely because part of it got obscured, and we wouldn't read from a blurred scroll. We can't have it be a blurred reading. And of course, people will also keep booing forever, which will drag out the length of time needed for doing a reading, and might also encourage the reader to begin prematurely, which is now blurring lines from the end part of it. I've been to one congregation where they actually had a traffic light brought out for Purim with red light, green light for doing the booing and all of that. We're pretty good here at TI of people doing a short, sharp blast about Haman, but as readers, it is something to bear in mind that if they start booing while you're saying Haman, you have to say it again. And if they keep booing for a long time, you just have to wait until they stop before you resume. And you might end up with some rabbinic admonishments to the crowd if it's really beginning to be a problem, but every congregation has their own style, their own culture on this, and we find something that works, but something to be kept in mind. Good, good. Oh, clicking on the wrong thing. All right, so let's do our little warm-up review when we're talking about trope. We got to remember our big rules. And I know for those of you who were there during my Torah class and who were here last week, this all seems very familiar. Good. I really want you to all have this memorized because this makes your life easier. Every word has a trope symbol. Every symbol is either a joiner or a stopper in the flow. That's what you got to keep in mind. Each word is being orchestrated, it is being conducted to join or to stop. The symbol will always appear under the accented syllable, which means that you'll know where to do the fancy part of the music in order to properly vocalize the word and have it on the correct stressed syllable. The other syllables are just chanted in a neutral note. Think of hitting the same key on the piano over and over again as kind of a holding pattern until you get to the symbol, and then you do the melody flourish. Most Hebrew words are accented on the final syllable, which is very convenient because it gets very easy. And if they aren't, then all you have to do is save an extra note or two in order to finish off the trope melody for the final couple syllables. That's it. Those are the big rules. If you got those down, you should be able to chant anything. Other things to bear in mind, trope usually comes in family blocks, as I have referenced in last week and in the Torah class by the minivan model of certain families. They go in the van always together, and when they go in a consistent pattern. Somebody is always the driver. They don't take turns. There's one symbol that is always the driver of that family of tropes, and that's what everything else revolves around. Once you learn that pattern, then you can predict, Sally's going to be in the back passenger on the back passenger side. Tommy's going to be on the back driver side. You can know where they're going to be, and that means you can predict what melody's coming next. It makes it much easier than trying to just memorize discrete elements. Remembering patterns is always easier than remembering just little data points, right? And of course, the melody motif of a given trope doesn't change, except for munach, which we're going to look at in more detail later tonight. Good review. All right, well, let's move that off of the symbols so we can see them. So here is what we went over last week without the names, just so that we can try and stretch ourselves and see if we can't remember them a little bit. Mercha tipcha, munach etnachta, and then mercha tipcha, mercha sof pasuk, kadma pashta, kadma mapach, pashta, munach kato. And in the Purim theme, it goes, mercha tipcha, munach etnachta, mercha tipcha, munach et nachta. And then, mercha tipcha, mercha sof pasuk. Mercha tipcha, mercha sof pasuk. And yes, those are same patterns. Munach is a little different because it's very flat as opposed to mercha, which has a slight downtone. But really, they are almost indistinguishable in the actual chanting. And then our Haton family goes Hadma pach hashta munach Haton. Hadma pach hashta munach Haton. And again, they're all doing the same jobs of joining or separating. And the darker ones are the joiners, are the separators, and the lighter boxes are the joiners. Good, good. And just as a reminder, there are our names and put into full joining and stopping pictures. All right, so that's what we did last week, and you can go back to that video. Let's talk about a couple of new things before we get into our new trope. So the first thing is, I said earlier on in our big rules, every word has a trope. Well, that's 99% true. And when it's not true, we have an indicator of when it's not true. They look like hyphens, these little bars that will show up on the readings between two words. What that means is, when you look at this word and you see there are no tropes there, right? Nothing on these words. When you see the line, you realize that's not a misprint. This word is governed by the trope on the next word. So that means that these two are both connected to our mercha there at the beginning. And as I said before, we just keep hitting a neutral note until we get to the actual trope. So whenever you see those hyphens, it just means keep rolling down the page until you actually get to a trope symbol. This word is going to be chanted by that word, and don't pause along the way. So you're not going to say bechol levavecha. You're going to say bechol levavecha. You're going to be right running through one to the other. Now, I'm not going to chant this particular passage because this is obviously from the Hafta, and that is Torah and Torah trope. And if I go into Torah trope, I'll never get my brain back into Megillah trope. It's the hardest part about Purim morning is doing Torah and Purim trope and having my brain not want to stick with one or the other. All right, so that's what those hyphens mean. They're not actually anything grammatical. It's not about a compound word. It's just a trope guide of keep rolling and connect to the next word. Good, good. One other pronunciation guide that I want to always review with people is what's known as the kamatz katan. The kamatz katan, or the T-shaped vowel, well, the kamatz normally sounds like an ah. It's one of the first vowels that many people will learn when they're learning Hebrew, and they learn T-shape means ah, T-shape means ah. And yeah, 90% of the time, that is absolutely true. However, there are grammatical times where the stress of a word will change the length of a vowel. We do this in English all the time too. We just don't tell you that we're doing it, which is very confusing to foreigners, right? If I have a picture from my camera, it's a photo. Both are long O sounds. But if I want to make that a full word, it's a photograph. It's not a photograph. I shorten that O into an when I say that. And then if I have somebody whose job it is to take those photos, he's a photographer. Now that becomes an we're shifting around the accent and we stretch and shorten vowels in order to do that. In English, we do that constantly. We just don't notice it, and our spelling does not show it. Most of the time in Hebrew, the spelling will show it. The vowels will physically change. So you'll go from an O to an or things like that, or to an into an form. That's why you'll have arev rather than erev, depending upon the passage. The exception to that is the kamatz. The kamatz can change, but it will not physically look different in some books, but it still needs to be pronounced as an O. Now, there are grammar rules of how to figure out whether this is meant to be an O or not an O pronunciation. It has to do with if it's unaccented and closed syllables and all sorts of little exceptions. I'm not going to go into that because we live in the modern world of wonderful technology, and many, many modern books will show you when it should be an O. So if you look in a book and it has a larger kamatz as opposed to the standard size one, then you know that one is meant to be pronounced as an O. And this one is pronounced as your standard A. Some other books will print them a little differently. Here we see a different edition where it's a little bit of a longer T shape, but it's still following the same basic pattern. And here is a tikkun, sorry for the blurry picture, which does much the same, which is that most books nowadays will try to show you where it's meant to be a kamatz katan and thus an O sound in order to make your life easier. If you look carefully in our Sidur, you can see that it's done. The print is a little small, so it's not always immediately obvious where that's happening, but once you get used to spotting it, it's no problem. And if you are working off any of the sheets that I send out, I always send out from a printout that uses very clear differentiations between the kamatz katan and the kamatz, the O and the A sound. If you ever have questions, just ask. And I'm happy to confirm or say that that's not a kamatz katan if you're confused in a particular passage. But it is a sign of good readership if you're getting your vowels correctly. And this is one of those places where once you hear it, you won't know how you ever did without it. Okay. Also, we need to just cover the wonderful topic that some words will get two trope symbols. That is to say, there will be one trope under one syllable and another trope under another syllable, or over or under another syllable. This is the most common combination, the munach katon. No problem. You chant both of them. You just chant them each on their own syllable, and you chant them as one word, meaning you're not taking a breath in the middle of that either. So that just gets chanted. And although that's ve'ahavta, I've got to break myself away from Torah because instantly as I said that, it came back to Torah. Da 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 ve'ahavta would be how we would chant that for Megillat Esther. Ve'ahavta. And here it's one word, but getting two melody sounds. Good, good. Yeah. I should have picked a different word. As soon as I look at that, my brain can't help itself but go into Torah trope. And that's not helpful because my brain then can't get out of that. Yes.
For like two vowels that make an all sound, and not just have one vowel.
So why do we have a bunch of vowels that make the same sound? So for example, the two ah sounds, the patach and the kamatz, the bar and the T shape. We also have two different O sounds. We have two different U sounds. We've got the and then we have the with two dots next to it. We have the the line with two dots next to it. Because technically, they don't all make the same sound. They all make the same sound for everybody who's alive today. But historically, those were gradations of vowels that our ear and language usage, even the most native of Hebrew speakers in Israel today, don't differentiate between. So they still are there because historically they mattered. They actually did represent a lengthening or shortening of a vowel in certain ways. So an and an would be two different sounds. We don't hear that anymore, and we don't use it anymore. But we're not going to change the spelling.
And the same question about like there's like two T consonants. Why not just have one?
Again, the double consonants, the consonants that sound the same to us now, had their own job in the ancient world. They had slight variations within them. The most famous and the one that we still can hear very clearly among certain communities is the aleph and the ayin. That those look like they are the same silent vowel or silent word. You just say the vowel, but those are two technically different sounds. The ayin is a guttural sound, whereas the aleph is higher up in the mouth. So it would be the difference between saying and ah. But I can't do that very well. But the Yemenite community in particular had preserved that pronunciation distinction all the way up into modern day. But most of the rest of us, we treat them interchangeably. Which makes it harder for us to spell because we don't always hear those letters difference, but they must be terrific spellings on it. So yeah, they did matter, but now they're the panda's thumb. They are vestigial elements of a language. But, we're not going to change it because we've got books written in that language that mean a great deal to us in their exact form. Whole off topic, on topic, but outside the scope of this class, the same thing happened in English. We ended up with Webster's dictionary because he was trying to fix English and get rid of all of those vestigial elements that had been added and to it and spun into it through various language invasions in English. And he wanted to make it standardized and correct and proper. And he got like halfway through and then gave up. So, but that's why we have American spelling versus British spelling and all of that. It was, yeah, we've tried to clean up English a little bit, but English is even worse than Hebrew. And we got what we got. And sometimes we just have to say, history. Anyway, here's how we say it. We do a whole class on linguistics sometime. It'd be a lot of fun. But let's get back to tonight's main topic, which is these new tropes. We went over the bulk trope last week. Now we're going over the first order of odd trope, unusual trope. These guys do not come up nearly as often, but they do come up regularly. So they're not weird, really, in the sense that almost every section of text will have at least one or two of them occasionally, but they'll have one or two of them, as opposed to the etnachta, the sof pasuk, and the katon families, which almost every sentence will have, well, at least one etnachta, one sof pasuk, and any number of the katon families will show up. So we're going to run through this page. I'm going to do each line twice, and then we're going to practice each one of the sections individually. Okay, so this is getting back into Purim trope. Tarka hevir, tarka hevir, atma ve'aslah munach revi. Atma ve'aslah munach revi. Geshayi munach legame lisha gedola yati. Geshayi munach legame lisha gedola yati. All right, so that's our basic set that we're going to be practicing tonight. And you can always go back to this page in YouTube to just review as a block. You may notice things like da 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 dee da 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 dee da da. As one of my cantors, when I was learning this, explained, thank you, Cantor Beagle Eisen, there is a almost laughing quality to some of the trope that it's almost like a little bit of a chuckle built in. And that's really helped me not only remember the trope, but it's also helped me stay in the right frame of mind when chanting this, that this is really meant to flow in a way that is a little bit more peppy, a little bit more happy than the melodies that we use for other types of scrolls or for the Torah and Haftorah. All right, shall we dive in? All right, that's what you're all here for. Come on, machine. All right, so this pairing is very, very common, the darga to vir. So let's go over it again, and then we will see its variations. Darga to vir, darga to vir. They come together a lot, not just in Megillah, but obviously in Torah and Haftarah as well. So we can put them in their regular seats in the car. Tavir is driving, which means we start over here. But sometimes we'll get a little lead into that, beginning with a kadma. Kadma, darga, tavir. Kadma, darga, tavir. Sometimes we will lose our darga entirely and just start off with Kadma merchatevir. Kadma merchatevir. Sometimes we'll just streamline it to Merchatevir, Merchatevir. And yeah, Merchat can't compete next to Tevir. It sounds like nothing. And that means we can now put them into our words. Again, as I've recommended before, try and strap on some English and just use the melodies. It's a great way to get a feel for the melodies without having to also fight the Hebrew at the same time. Let's start up, sorry. Old cars, my friend is sick. The house is new on top. And these are usually shorter phrases, obviously, in the text. We're not going to get whole clauses and sentences, although occasionally, depending upon Hebrew's wonderful efficiency, we might get a little. All right, now our next set of tropes that gets a little bit fancier is governed by Revi'i. That's the big laugh with the diamond coming down. And we're going to go through this one, and then we'll show the combinations. Adma ve'azla munach revi'i. Adma ve'azla munach revi'i. So, as I said, you can really hear that belly laugh coming from revi'i. And, feel free to chuckle it up as you like. Our classic version then that we just did. Adma ve'azla munach revi'i. Adma ve'azla munach revi'i. Version number 2, come on. Adma ve'azla revi'i. Adma ve'azla revi'i. Or we can just do a short one. Munach revi'i. Munach revi'i. You can hear that munach here is already beginning that cascade of dropping down into that munach. And sorry, that revi'i. And sometimes revi'i can just come by itself. Revi'i. All right. And sometimes kadma ve'azla by themselves. Kadma ve'azla. Kadma ve'azla. So let's strap on some English and see what we got. The rain brought floods. Abraham, his father, died. Moses left. Joshua and Caleb. And so. Okay. Now, we can get a couple more combinations. That is to say, this munach revi'i can sometimes get additional trope right in front of it. So all 3 of these are combos with this munach revi'i. Sometimes they can come by themselves as well. So we'll go through them again, like we did on the very first song. Gershayim munach revi'i. Lisha gedola munach revi'i. Munach legarmeh munach revi'i. All sets work just like that. So if we want to just do one variation of each, Spain needs rain. My son didn't finish. Sarah loved Isaac. So, same pattern that you would see on any other trope system, just with a slightly different set of melodies. Move that out of the way, yes. All right, now as I've been mentioning, this munach, this right angle, backwards L, take whatever you want to call it, he works as a combo. He works as a helper. He is always getting you ready for the next trope. That means that, unlike I said earlier, that every symbol has a consistent melody, he technically doesn't, because he sounds different in each combination. but he technically does, because he sounds the same within that combination. So munach plus etnachta, the wishbone, is always going to sound the same. If he comes before that wishbone, he will reliably sound the same as every other munach coming before a wishbone. Likewise, if he comes before katon, the two dots, he will sound like every other munach coming before the two dots for katon. So you just have to learn him as a pair rather than learning him by himself. So there's a slight additional visual cue that you're looking for. Rather than just the one symbol, you need to find that pair. But when you do, you're fine. So like we did for etnachta, we know it's just nice and flat. Munach etnachta, munach etnachta. And as we were just doing, munach revihi, munach revihi. And then as we did last week as well, munach katon, munach katon. And as we need to learn now, when we go before Tlisha Gedolah, or many of the other ones as well, it goes munach Tlisha Gedolah, munach Tlisha Gedolah. And all of them, they are really trying to lead it in to whatever the word is, because munach is the ultimate helper, it is the ultimate joiner for the word that comes right after. Clear enough? I know if our ancestors had only thought of multiple symbols rather than using the same one in all those places, that would have made life easier. But it would have also made the grammar harder. Because when you see a munach, you know exactly what to expect grammatically. This is leading me into the next word perfectly, tightly. It is a very tight connection. And if we had 4 different symbols, then we would have to rank which one is a tighter connection than the other. This way we know they're all equally connected. Grammatically, this is much clearer. Phonetically, it would be nice to have had multiple symbols. Maybe someday in our future, someone might put like a munach with like a star, and a munach with a circle, and a munach with a square. But you know, at that point, you might as well just look to the next word, and there's your cue of what it's meant to sound like. All right, our last trope for tonight is yativ. Yativ in every variation, whether it is Torah, Haftarah, Purim, or elsewise, is always a short, sharp little yell. And it will usually come on a short, sharp little word. You don't get giant words with yativ as their melody. So it's just yativ, munach katon, or yativ, katon. That's it. Very much just like in Torah, Haftarah. It's just that little verbal punch, if you will, that gets you in that particular. It's really about the size of the word and the structure of that phrase.
It's not clockwork.
Mapach. Mapach is, in a second, I need to use my arrow keys for that. Where's my last mapach? Hold on a second. I think that was back up on our review. There we go. Mapach looks like a less than symbol.
So yativ is going one way. And
No. Very okay. I see what your question is. So there's a mapach. Everybody take a look down here at the bottom section. I'm talking to my YouTube folks. And then we scroll back down to our yativ. And yativ looks the same in most printed editions, except it is hanging off the right-hand side of the word. Mapach will always be under the syllable that gets accented. Yativ will always be hanging off the right-hand side, in much the same way that pashta, the up loop, will hang off the left-hand side of a word. Now, like I said, yativ usually going along with a shortish word, so it's not usually a question of what syllable gets accented. So we don't have the same question as like with pashta, where sometimes you'll end up with 2 of them on a word because the accented syllable is not the last syllable. But yes, they look the same. Now, many modern tikkunim will not only print yativ off to the right, as is customary, they will also draw it slightly different, a thinner line, a sharper line. I've seen it also drawn as a full triangle. They'll fill in the last, the vertical line there, rather than leaving it open to make it a little bit more distinct than a mapach, that less than symbol. But really, if you just look for where it is under the word, visually you'll be able to identify it's always sticking off, depending upon your print, sometimes even before the word begins, like in the space right in front of it, but often just right smack under the first stroke of that first letter. And that's how you know it's Yatif. All right. That's it for today. The day was the short one because we were doing all of the mid-level trope. Any questions? Wow, I must be absorbing it so easily. I know this is really a repetition skill. It is something that has to be done over and over again. It's not so much like a question in the room. It's doing it again, and then sometimes you might find, oh, I'm having a hard time hearing the difference between A and B, or getting the right notes for this on this particular tricky word. And then, let me know and we can talk about that. But the basics of it is what we've done. Now it's just a matter of working on a piece of text. And I think that I've got at least 3 students now who are working on pieces of text. So we'll see how you guys go. And if you want to do that as part of the class, I'd be happy to hear what you're working on next week. If you would like to do it privately because you're uncomfortable doing it publicly, I'm happy to make time either in person, over the phone, Zoom, or whatever you like. And that goes for any YouTube folks as well. Well, let me bring up my full YouTube Brady Bunch view so I can see who's out there. Anybody interested in doing it, I'm sure that you'd be in person if you could. Doesn't mean you shouldn't participate. If you want to learn a piece, let me know, and I'll be happy to send you text and the recordings and get you going. It doesn't mean you have to sign up this year for Purim. It's just learning the skill right now. If you want to do it this year, that's fine. We do mix up the Hebrew and the English when we're doing the reading, so there are plenty of very manageable portions of Megillat Esther. A reminder as well, in case you don't remember from me talking last week, the Megillah is traditionally read from a scroll that is like the Torah, meaning no vowels, no cantillation on the page. So it does have that slightly higher mental load in preparing for it, as opposed to like a Haftarah, or as opposed to chanting from the Book of Lamentations or any of the other Megillot where we read with vowels. So if you're taking that on, let me know, and I'll be happy to help you along the way. I'm just doing it for personal growth. Let me know, and I'm happy to help you there too. All right. Thank you all very much. And now we begin the reverse process of all of the YouTube and everything else. Take care, everyone.